Hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little bit about the contexts of communication. Now up to this point you've learned that messages themselves are arbitrary until humans give them meaning, right? We give words meaning, and a lot of that depends on the context of the message as well, considering where the message is taking place. Who's delivering the message, who's receiving the message, who's the sender and the receiver. All of those things count. But what we also have to consider are the actual context breakdowns of what kind of communication are we talking about? Meaning, is it intrapersonal? Okay, we'll talk about each of these. Is it dyadic or interpersonal? Is it small group, organizational, public, or is it mass communication? So let's talk a little bit about each of those. Intrapersonal communication, this is the probably constant communication that takes place inside your own head. It's that little voice. It's your inner monologue, and all of those thoughts that you have that aren't necessarily coming out. But be careful, they may be coming out non-verbally, right? A lot of communicating, actually most of it comes out through non-verbal communication as opposed to verbal, but we'll talk about that in a later module. And then there's also dyadic or interpersonal communication. This takes place between two people, right? So there's a sender and a receiver, or an encoder and a decoder of those messages. It's when they interact. This is regardless of channel. By channel, I mean, is it a text message? Is it face-to-face? All of these things come into consideration. Because typically these interpersonal communication events, they're with close relationships. You pay closer attention to how you're sending the message or how you're receiving it. As you would imagine, many things can affect this, right? Is this a family member? Is this a close friend? Is this a childhood friend? Things like that, including the background of each person in the conversation. And then there's also small group communication. This is the kind of communication that could be between your family and yourself. It could be a team, a sports team. It could be a working group in class. It could be a small group at work, for example. It could be you working in the community. This is the type of communication where everyone can participate. So if you're all sitting around a table, everybody may have the opportunity to speak and to be heard, or to listen to what others are saying. This differs a little from organizational communication. This is a larger and more permanent collection of people that work together towards a common goal. So for example, the supervisor says, okay, I want these 4 people to work on this particular project, and here's your goal. So this could be a for-profit business, nonprofit. It could be a political action committee, right? It could be a sports league, anything like that. And typically these groups will share a culture. Okay, so I would assume many of you are in the working world, and if you think of where you work, it has its own organizational culture. In fact, sometimes we're trained in it. Okay, so for example, if you work for a restaurant, you will be trained. This is the culture of this restaurant. This is how you should be treating the clients that come in to order food and so forth. Well, this is true kind of anywhere that you work. Okay, and so that really revolves around that organizational communication between those that work in the same place and should be at least working towards common goals. So, take a moment to think about a situation where you could or have, for example, told the same story but in different communication contexts. For example, if you are doing that intrapersonal communication inside your head, is that different, right, from what might actually come out of your mouth in a dyadic or interpersonal conversation, right? And if you told that same story to a small group at work, would it differ from a small group within your family? Would that differ from that same conversation or topic that you would cover with people at work, and so forth? So that's where you really begin to understand that the context of your messages really differ and depend on which sort of context that you're sort of immersed in at that moment. An example, right? So if I see my my boss at work, and we're having a conversation about what we're doing after work. That might differ greatly with that particular person, right, in my organizational culture, than it might be in an interpersonal conversation with my best friend of what I'm maybe actually doing after work, right? So a lot of this depends on context. So to cover the last two contexts that we cover in this course, consider public communication. So this occurs when a group becomes simply too large for all members to contribute. And there is a speaker and an audience, and that audience typically doesn't respond per se, one person in the crowd, unless they're called upon, right, by whomever is speaking. It is often structured, and one person is more in charge, even with questions asked in person or online. Because of course so much of the communication we do now is online as opposed to in person. So this could be a political speech, right? It could be it could be a fundraiser of someone giving a speech for any sort of a fundraiser. It could be your teacher in class. You go into a class of 30 or more people, and you have the teacher in front of the class, and they are controlling what is going on in the communication of that context. So that is considered public communication. That differs from mass communication. Okay, so mass communication, these are messages that are transmitted to large audiences via electronic or print media, right? Print is becoming more and more rare. However, think back to the past where people would be watching the news, okay? And this was one-way communication, okay? There's often no contact between the sender and receiver of the messages. However, the introduction of social media began to blur these lines. It was the first time in history, electronically, when somebody could send out a message and then people can respond, okay? Think to The Voice, where you're responding to who you think the best singer is, right, on that TV show and so forth, or any kind of social media, right? So if I'm a big star and I'm sending out a message, people might be able to send messages back via Instagram or whatever it may be. Social media, it's important to know that these are often financed by advertisers and so forth. So we're going to talk more about bias in media a little later on in this module, but it's important to understand that mass media, this has changed drastically, right, in the last 10, 20 years. But generally speaking, these are going to the largest audiences. These are going to millions of people, right? So that's kind of the difference. Now, when we think about social media, right, this, of course, has changed. So what did it change from to? Well, it changed from one-way or linear communication to dyadic, right? This is transactional now, where that was never possible with mass communication in the past. Users on social media, they can generate their own content. Okay, this is can be quite different from mass media or otherwise. Audience sizes vary, can go from a few friends on Instagram to millions, and generally public communication can overlap with social media. So that's important to keep in mind too. And it can be entertaining, social, a means of identity management, right? You might have a different identity on Facebook than you do with Instagram, because Facebook, that's the older generation checking that out now. Nobody else is on Facebook. The young folks do, Instagram or others. And so you may portray yourself a little differently between those two social media choices. It can hijack your time. I know that for sure. It can distract you. And sometimes not have a good outcome, sometimes have great outcomes, right? It can differ, but it's important to know and think about and understand how the messages are created, how they're perceived, who's controlling your feeds, right, in your own social media, and what kind of a historical impact has social media had on communication. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more in this class. It really feeds into things like bias, right? Who exactly is sharing those messages and why? Who are the gatekeepers? The gatekeepers, these are the people actually in charge, making the final decisions of the messages that are being sent out, right? So if you take any of the big networks, who are making those decisions? Those are the gatekeepers. Those are the, you know, the owners and sometimes the producers and the executives of that network. And who influences them? You know, the folks that are giving, that are donating money, right, to ads and things, or certain perspectives that are shared. So that feeds into any kind of mass media, right? So that's important to remember, and to also think about diversifying your own choices on the things that the information that you want to watch, and know that sometimes you need some different perspectives to decide for yourself what your point of view may be on any given topic. So with that, I will stop this video, and you will move on in the module to bias and gatekeeper videos and so forth. So I hope this was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the module.